Right. So then just before we start, obviously speeches are 7 minutes in length with the first and last minute being protected time. Just make sure to time yourselves because we will be putting times into the chat. So the motion is this House prefers a world where social movements excessively use necro-resistance as a form of protest. And without further ado, I'd like to invite the PM.
Hi, yeah. My name's Danya, and I use she, her pronouns. I take POIs in the chat. Because this is being recorded, I just want to take 30 seconds to say like a few thank yous. I just want to like really thank my family for being supportive and like waking me up at 7 a.m. every day to do this tournament. And also thank you to Fatima, my debate partner, for always being there and for like making this tournament a really fun thing and for making every tournament I've done with them a really fun thing to do. And without further ado, I'll start my speech in three, two, one. The reason the Tibetan government can ask for autonomy under China is because the Tibetan resistance movement used self-immolation to get Western media to care about them and pressurize China on an international stage. On side opposition, when you just organize protests every year, you're never able to get this kind of exposure and never get meaningful support and change for social movements. And I'm so proud to propose. I think this would look like social movements far likely to do this when you have large amounts of oppression. It looks like the Jim Crow era, the civil rights movement, where you're far more likely to go on hunger strikes, where suffragettes will be far more likely to chain themselves to voting boxes. And the modern times, this looks like the feminist movement using this technique after someone gets harassed or like to protest against really ignorant laws. I want to talk about two things in this speech. Firstly, why does the necro-resistance lead to more change and often invisibility for these movements? Secondly, on why does necro-resistance not receive mass backlash? And thirdly, just weighing on why this is better than all forms of resistance. Firstly, on why does the necro-resistance lead to more change, opt-in, and visibility? I think the way you get change is that you have moderates to swing towards your side, things like sign petitions, show up for protests, or like just in general, speak up and advocate for this movement. Secondly, it looks like Supreme Court rulings on the constitution, laws, just having legal recourse about the protests or like whatever messaging that you advocate for. I think then you're able to get more change, visibility, and better perception because one, it's an extreme form of resistance, and this simply just catches more media attention. The Tibet self-immolation caught the Western media attention, and this is crucial for visibility to media that is geographically distant and therefore not that close to the actual cause or not experiencing the oppression. This is how you get international media to be able to respond. Secondly, we think that the movement becomes a bit smaller and only about people who genuinely care about it because of this extreme form of resistance. We then think this is actually better because A, no sense of complacency is built within the movement. Every single person aim towards one thing because because the most dedicated people join. I think the problem with big social movements is that often they get performative, and in the vast majority of cases, they're far more likely to become complacent. And because lots of people join, and often like really random people join, you're never able to come to a consensus of what the movement is about. And this just leads to infighting, fracturing, and this breakdown of the movement. Secondly, movements are increasingly fighting for issues to the courts, like how the legalization of the LGBTQ cause in Mexico came to the Supreme Court, or how abortion rights in the US have been protected historically through like Roe v. Wade, rather than legislative measures, which relatively requires less people. Secondly, broad social movements can often be less effective than more targeted movements because the broader a movement is, the more watered down its messaging becomes to cater to as many people as possible within the movement to avoid fracturing. Lastly, the third point then, that social justice movements are perceived to be elitist after a point because only privileged people stay with a lot of time to protest, stay within the movement. But when this is displayed on the media, people think these are people who genuinely believe in the case from the grassroots level and genuinely want to fight for the cause. Fourthly, that you have better capacity to affect messaging. They say when you get that media attention, they say that this is the reason why we are doing this. Our oppression is really bad that took us to this point. Fifthly, it's easier to control media narratives as it's hard to turn people setting themselves on fire or gluing themselves to trees into something bad. What's on their side? It's really easy to cherry pick examples of resistance as being really bad and therefore turning the media against them. Then sixthly, we think the Overton window changes. It's the fact that when you have large amounts of media coverage, the long-term narrative shifts and the people's idea of what is radical changes and becomes easier to ask for certain things. Like I gave you the Tibet example at first, that China didn't just tell them, I don't care about whatever your autonomy or whatever you require, because they were able to shift the Overton window and make it seem like the most radical thing is not the fact that Tibet gets autonomy under China, but that Tibet gets full independence. On their side, I want to note that either you eventually get violent because you're sick of people not listening to you and sick of the oppression. This looks like the Gilets Jaunes movement in France against like really high taxes on people. So you get the same harms as us, as they might point out, or you do the forms of protest that aren't seen as disruptive and therefore don't get media visibility or enough emotional impact to get people together. Therefore, you get better perception, therefore more money. You also get more media coverage and more ability to just affect change in general. Before I move on to why does necro-resistance not receive mass backlash, I'll take a point from closing.
What does it mean to excessively use this?
This means that this is often like your main form of protest. It's often a way, like whenever you're organizing a protest, it would mean to use necro-resistance. Like, for example, the Tibetan movement used self-immolation quite a bit, and that's what got the media coverage. Why does the necro-resistance not receive backlash? It's often hurting yourself and not other people. So there's no violence towards other people, and therefore fewer backlash. Secondly, it's easier for people to sympathize with the oppressed and with people within the social movement, because outsiders think that what led them to literally harm themselves must have been really bad, because we all inherently value human life and we know how hard it is to harm ourselves. Thirdly, it puts a lot of scrutiny on states when they don't respond to this form of resistance. And if they respond through further crackdowns, they're only hurting these protesters further. And this delegitimizes the government. It reduces like the popular legitimacy among people. Even if there's backlash, there's way to justify this to more conservative people. For example, lots of like queer advocacy groups in countries like UK justify gay marriage to conservative groups by appealing to values such as the state shouldn't interfere with what private citizens can do. You can mitigate the harms of backlash by publicly justifying policies. And even if backlash happens, the status quo is often so untenable and so oppressive that the harms of backlash are minimal. Even if, like, would a Syrian refugee turn down the opportunity of coming to the US just because there's a marginal increase in xenophobic sentiment? That's not to say that xenophobia is okay, but it's rather to say that the harms of backlash are often going to be quite marginal and relatively insignificant relative to the status quo. Also, maybe this just isn't the tipping point to people hating the movement or hating a policy. There's a lot of other things that can make them hate the policy, things such as like pre-established party affiliation, family values, and other things. Lastly, then, why is necro-resistance better than all forms of resistance? It's the quickest way to do this and quickest way to get change, and that's important to prevent volunteer exhaustion, to prevent the catalyst for the entire cause to roll over, like the Nirbhaya case in India for the Me Too movement. Thirdly, it's to ensure that funding doesn't run out. And lastly, is to ensure that the movement doesn't start to fracture and start to fight, as it requires more and more time. For all these reasons, I'm so proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd now like to invite the Leader of Opposition to begin.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
All right, just give me a few seconds, please. All right, before I start my speech, I would like to give a few thank yous to a few people. First of all, is obviously my parents for supporting me throughout my debating career. And second of all, my partner, Nagisan. I know he's not here. He is judging another tournament, but he is one of the reasons why I have been pushing myself so hard in debate. Thank you very much to him. And third is obviously my debating partner, Yugi. He has been there since day one. He has seen how much I've grown as a debater. Being a novice, I am very, very grateful to have you as my teammate. And how to say, he's just not a friend of mine. He has been a great coach throughout, and I've learned a lot as a novice debater. So with that, then let me just quickly set up my timer. In a world where excessive necro-resistance, we don't get more justice, we get more chaos, more suffering, and more silence. With that, then, let's move on to a few callouts that has been running by OG, right? Number one, OG says excessive necro-resistance is equals to more media visibility, right? Here's the call out then. Visibility does not guarantee support, right? Especially when what the media shows is constant, extreme, and violent imagery. When protests are extreme all the time, the media narrative becomes about the chaos, the spectacle, not about the cause itself, right? Few reasons why. Number one, when every protest is people chaining themselves, burning themselves, or starving themselves, the shock factor then disappears. Number two, then, media consumers become numb, just like during like COVID, right? When people saw death statistics every day and eventually stopped caring, right? What does this look like then? The public then tunes out instead of feeling outraged, right? Meaning to say, visibility without trust, without relatability, just turns social movements into noise, right? Second, then, OG says how excessive negro resistance forces quicker change, right? Here's the call out. Change only happens when you have sustained political pressure, not just emotional reactions. Extreme protests might grab headlines for a day, but long-term change, like ending like getting civil rights or even getting fair labor laws, right? It took years of smart organizing, not just flashes of spectacle, right? Few reasons to this. Number one, excessive necro-resistance burns out movements too fast. So when the primary method is self-destruction, activists physically and mentally cannot survive long enough to build these coalitions, right? Run political campaigns or create new institutions. Government can just wait for activists to collapse from exhaustion instead of just conceding, right? Meaning to say, quick media attention is not the same as winning lasting systemic change. Third call out then. OG tells excessive necro-resistance makes the issue seem urgent. If everyone uses extreme measures for every cause, urgency then loses its meaning, right? If you light yourself on fire to protest higher bus fares and someone else changed themselves for a new park being built, people stop being able to tell real emergencies from ordinary disputes, right? Few reasons to this. The moral power of necro-resistance, it depends on being rare and proportionate, right? When it happens too often, then it becomes like a background noise. People feel overwhelmed, confused, and emotionally disconnected. The real victims of serious injustices, they suffer more because their protests are drowned out by a sea of constant drama, right? If everything is urgent, nothing feels urgent anymore, is what I'm trying to say. In OG's world, activism because like a fire alarm that goes off every hour. At first, people panic, eventually people are just going to ignore. At least in our side, resistance then stays rare, powerful, and it is at least reserved for when society truly needs to wake up, right? With that, then, here are few clearer characterization and framing, right? In this debate, right, excessive use of necro-resistance, it clearly means that activists, they no longer reserve these extreme forms of protest for the most serious or life-threatening injustices, right? Instead, necro-resistance becomes a common, like an everyday tool used even for smaller scale issues. In a normal world today, necro-resistance, right, like maybe hunger strikes or like just chaining oneself to buildings, it's rare or it's symbolic and only used when all peaceful and reasonable methods have failed. It carries this moral weight because it shows this injustice is so severe that I am willing to risk my life for it. But in the world, the government wants, necro-resistance is very normalized. It's used very early in a conflict, sometimes before peaceful options like petitions or peaceful marches or like negotiations are even like tried in their world, right? The threshold for using extreme protest, it's going to drop dramatically. Let's just say today you might chain yourself to a tree to stop the destruction of an indigenous sacred site, right? Like in their world, you chain yourself even when the government cuts trees for a new bike path in a middle class neighborhood. Then this means to say that the necro-resistance, it shifts from being a powerful last weapon to being a very first move, even over moderate or negotiable problems then. Moving on to the framing. In the government's world, where necro-resistance is overused, the image of social movements fundamentally then changes. Today, when we see activists risking their lives, we feel, one, they must be facing something really serious. Number two, they must have tried everything else. Number three, their suffering highlights the real brutality of the system, right? But when necro-resistance becomes excessive and common, the public then they no longer feel that activists are noble or wise. They are seen as emotional or irrational as a whole. People then start believing activists are addicted to drama, right? Not genuinely fighting for important causes. Every protest starts feeling overly intense or too emotional to the actual injustice being protested. So with that then, easier framing for you all to understand, in the ops world, necro-resistance, it remains rare. It's a second act that signals that the gravity of real injustice. In government's world, necro-resistance becomes very cheapened and becomes cheapened by overuse then. Moving on to my argument then. One argument I would like to bring up, which is how this is going to create like an irrational perception, right? First layer then, why we feel public support matters. We tell you social movements, they can't win by themselves. They need normal people, which is the majority, to care and pressure the government too. Politicians only change laws when they feel voters will punish them if they don't. So winning public trust is necessary for any movement to succeed. Two then, why excessive necro-resistance kills public trust. When people see activists, they constantly chaining themselves, they stop seeing activists relatable. Normal people are going to think they are too emotional or too extreme. They can't even think clearly. Even if the cause is good, people associate the cause with irrational behavior. Third, then, why this hurts real change, right? First thing, without public trust, movements have no leverage over governments or companies. Governments and bad actors can easily say, see, these people are dangerous and irresponsible. We shouldn't listen to them. Fourth, then, why this desensitization happens then. Number one, if necro-resistance happens all the time, people get too used to it. At first, hunger strikes and chaining to buildings like feel shocking and urgent. But if it happens every week, people are going to think, is this another protest, right? So how is this going to result then? Even when a huge injustice happens, nobody's going to feel the urgency or like the outrage anymore. Society then becomes numb. For all those reasons. Oh.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd now like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue their case.
Cool, just give me 15 seconds. I'm gonna go grab some water. Okay. Real quick before I start my speech, obviously, thanks to my partner Dania for carrying me both here and in GLC both years. Lots of thanks to my unemployed, really poor coaches. Oh, this is getting recorded. Okay, yeah, mostly Anshuman. Go to my goat, Nero, Xavier, and like the best partner I've ever spoken with, and to Team Youth at Risk for escaping the Matrix. Okay, cool. Speech starts in 3, 2, 1. If opposition was correct, then nobody would ever react to any protest ever, because they're all normalized to the fact that you have sit-ins, the fact that you encamp outside of colleges and therefore disrupt the workings of that. But clearly that's not how it works, because the way in which protests function on either side of the house isn't that you have a protest literally every single day, like very proximate to you, like probably in different areas you might have. The way in which protests function is that they are always done at a point at which there is excessive need for you to change over, where there is excessive resistance that is necessary to be done, because that is how you get the critical mass to be able to hold anything like this in any side of the house. What we do is we tweak the way in which you use that resistance, i.e., because the norm is now you use necro-resistance, you're far more likely to do things like attach yourself to like voting booths or chain yourself to like I don't know, like the walls of oppressive institutions or whatever. That is incredibly crucial, because all of their stuff on this is the shock value of this goes down just doesn't make sense for three main reasons at the top of this speech. The first is that I think there's an inherent gut feeling which you feel when you see people being hurt. Like, and this is the same reason for why, despite wars like the one in Gaza being dragged on for so long, people still feel the inherent like drop in their stomach when they see like children dying. I think this is very similar. This is the reasoning for this, is that we have a survival instinct that makes us care about people being hurt in the first place, and therefore biologically we will never be able to get like used to this shock. The only way you get used to like seeing people getting hurt on a daily basis if you like consume lots of gore, and I'm unsure, I just don't think that's the way in which this is like likely to play out. But the second thing I want to say about like this entire shock factor thing is that the fact that the protests still happen relatively infrequently means that you have the when protests happen, you're just far more likely to care about them, given that you're far more likely to see them within the media, and you're far more likely to therefore like be affected by them in the first place. Worst case, I just think you never have the like self-immolation or necro-resistance on their side, which means that even when you have like when you do have them, I think this is far more likely to turn like violent before it turns into necro-resistance, because this is just like the easiest way out of your anger or the injustice that makes you feel so angry in the first place. The problem with that is that this makes all the perception arguments that opposition makes far worse, for the reasons that Dania already noted, which is that this means that you're able to weaponize this against movement. On our side, I'd argue there's a net amount of empathy that you experience, and that's just far better for these movements in the first place. Cool. Dealing with but also like secondly, within the shock factor thing, I still like think that the reason that protests work is you just like disrupt a lot of government machinery. You just disrupt them far more when you do like
POI.
resistance. I'll take POS by chat, by the way. I just think we are far more likely to like stop the government infrastructure or stop things from happening administratively when you chain yourself to buildings rather than like have peaceful sit-ins. The second thing they say is that you have people within the movement get burned out. The first thing I want to do at the top of this is prove that this is not true. I just think you have far more political support and far more people sign petitions, as Dania noted in her speech, on our side of the house. The reasoning for this was simple, was that it was not only that you feel empathy towards these people, that you see like media visibility, which is often like people within Western liberal democracies are far more likely to see this and therefore support you, not only financially by like funding your GoFundMes, which is like really good, I think, insofar as you have more money to be able to like get your encampments or like get speakers to speak at rallies, but also that you have far more people who are like putting pressure upon the government in the first place in order to get these changes, especially within like relatively developing or authoritarian regimes. But the second thing that we said is that people are likely to sign petitions at the point at which they realize that this issue harms people to the extent that they're willing to harm themselves. And the argumentation from Dania here was that people are people are likely to like them sign petition, blah blah blah. The second thing, and therefore you appeal to moderates and conservatives, and that's incredibly important. But the second thing we said is that you don't alienate hardliners on our side of the house. Even if you have a smaller movement, like the way in which we get legal change often isn't by getting every single person in the country to agree to the movement. It is by going to the Supreme Court and getting like crucial judgments like Roe v. Wade passed, which is the way in which we mechanize this out in Dania's speech. The way that you get that is by getting lots of people that really care about this movement to do things. The problem on their side is that if you do peaceful sit-ins and protests, that after a certain point in time, these genuinely just lose out on people attending them in the first place, because there's no tangible impact that can be seen, insofar as they're far less likely to cause the same amount of change and take far more time, over which you're likely to lose out on funding, on support, because people genuinely just have to go back to their minimum wage jobs in the vast majority of cases. But also secondly, that you're far less likely to have these hardliners who campaign the most for your movement and prevent the dilution of messaging. What we told you is that on their side, you're far more likely to have fracturing within movements, insofar as these movements are just like allow free opt-in to anyone who doesn't genuinely want to give in, and are far more likely to have performative activism that like deems them far less useful in the long run. So sure, even if we have less protests in the long run, every single protest is a marginal step towards getting what you want to get, and like the change that you want to get in the long run. Before I move on, I will take that POI from CO if there is one. 3, 2, 1. Seeing none. OO. Seeing none. Moving on. Lastly, I just think on this time is crucial thing. If you have a lot of people when they initially realize that an issue has happened, so for example, like the Me Too movement, there was lots of support and like political capital to get things in the first place. I just think moderates who are supporting you are just far more likely to participate in these like self-immolation protests for that short period of time within which they care, and therefore get the mass amount of media visibility that allows you to like get change in the long run. I just want to take down some like I want to do some preemptive stuff on backlash and also deal with their like irrational support thing that they give. Three things here. The first is that when demands are so proximate and so necessary, like the Tibetan people who are like abused by China, I just think that this is likely to turn out in two ways. The first is what Dania tells you about violence, which I think is intuitively just harmful for social justice movements to do, not only for people who participate, but also for the perception and long-term change, like prospects, but also secondly on losing out on like whatever support. But secondly, I just think at the point at which you hurt yourself, it's it's far more difficult for like politicians to spin this and go, oh, this isn't relevant or like cherry pick this, insofar as what you are doing is like utilizing the social justice movement to spread the messaging of we are hurt in this large extent, rather than like hurting others or like disrupting things without any supposed reason, which is the way they're likely to do this on their side. But the last thing is that in the worst case, I just don't think this is the way that this like backlash is the way that this works, insofar as you compare this to other protests, and therefore there isn't like a net raise in backlash on either side of the house, on like either side of the house, because you just compare this through whatever the normative form is. For those reasons, proud to be an OG. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. I'd like to invite the DLO to finish up the top half.
Hi, sorry, can I check if I can be heard?
Yeah, you can.
Okay, all right. Hopefully I look good in the camera. Before I start, it's been a long time since I've been in the final, so let me just take this time to thank my contingent for being there with me all this time, for all the people who before and after me also debating with me. But very specifically to Farah, I've seen you at your very first tournament and how bad you were. You've improved a lot, and I'll take credit for that. But also thank you for so much for pairing up with me. I really appreciate this. And also glory to God. Namah Shivaya. The reason why the Hunger Games franchise was so famous was because it was so utopic, you would never assume it to happen, right? That's what made it engaging. But if you're a citizen of this world, this is just an annual event for you. The intensity of how you constantly face something is quite subjective. You are normalized to it, you're desensitized to it. Regardless of the aesthetics, you still fail to garner the change you set out there for the point in which something that is actively happening, it is happening around you, and there's nothing much you could do about it. You don't necessarily seek for change at that point, right? Like, sure, we're all still praying for Palestine in this scenario, but the way that the first bomb hit and how it was like, documented compared to the last bomb hit that was documented, you can clearly see the difference in the way that international media sensationalizes this issue, right? So then moving on to the aspects of opening government, why then they believe the way of visibility of media is the way to go for it. First off, they think that the way to get this is because, there's like an increased level of intensity towards the aspect of being someone who's utilizing necro-resistance. Let's note from the POI from CO as well, like clearly distributing the excessive usage of something at this point just normalizes it. The point in which you have one person who's caught on fire, this becomes a proximate issue. We're all caring about it from the very moment. But it just becomes something that's quite saturated. We're unsure as to how then that manifests. But sure, let's be charitable and see that it does manifest, right? How well are you then able to change that aspect, right? Because if we're talking about the Uyghurs in China or like, Rohingyas denied nationality within their own country, these are all consistent narratives that we've been hearing up until this moment. It is internationally sensationalized, right? But change never came by the way that proximately helps them. OG can't engage with this anymore, so let's hope that like CG has something tangible to say to this, right? OG doesn't prove how then these individuals will have an ability to garner change to the point in which you represent a quite niche community. Niche here obviously applies to how the feminism movement, despite its visibility, is still unable to garner change. Kamala Harris was denied presidency because there's still groups of people who view her as a woman, and that equates to incompetence in their minds, right? Problem here is that social movements exist within two aspects, and I think this is a necessary mechanism that was left out on OG as well, right? First thing is that they need to claim a level of visibility. This is to ensure that people are aware of your existence. And second, political change. This is the most tangible thing that you can have. Everyone wants to dismantle patriarchy. Political change is the way to go about it. On the aspect of visibility, then, Danya, the Prime Minister, tells you that they can cause an international sensation. Yeah, because the Tibetan protest was something that did shock people at that moment. A bit of psychology here, right? The shock and the sensation that you get from this viral media is something that happened because it's something you can't predict or something that you never expected to happen. Watch a horror movie and you know someone's gonna die. But when you're watching a K-drama and suddenly the main protagonist dies, it hits different. Your visibility in an international media doesn't manifest at the point in which it's oversaturated with these stories. Not only do you lower the impact of necro-resistance that generally has within, our side of the status quo, but in your retrospective world, you take away the more proximate harms for a person because the moment someone feels cheated by the patriarchal system, they use necro. When you're trans and you don't get gender affirming care, you use necro. When you're a child in a domestic household, you use necro. How do you then determine the intensity of these problems? How can you ensure the safety of these participants as well? Because let's not deny the fact that necro resistance is not something that you can actively do, which doesn't cause any irreversible harm. You're either physically putting your body on such a tool that is so bad for you, or you're mentally enduring this level of trauma by putting yourself in this sensationalized media. Though it might be proximate and important because you're vulnerable and this is your platform, we think there should be some form of protection to these people. More on that, on how OG just states like necro resistance is like the quickest way to go about this. Let's get clarification then. We aren't against necro resistance, nor do we disagree with OG on what changes happen, the point in which you use this tool, but an excessive use of it is disproportionate to the intensity of the movement. So sure, necro resistance in the status quo might be something that can cause these things to like happen, cause some sort of change that's quicker, i.e. the Tibetan movement or like the suffragists, right? Necro is quick, but in the point at which this is saturated and everyone is wanting to utilize this, right? One, you lose out on the level of legitimacy that you're able to have behind this movement. We are unsure from a perspective of a bystander how intense your movement is, the point in which everyone in your world is utilizing necro resistance one way or another. Second, then the point in which you cannot assure that some form of tangible change happens, you need to consistently have this movement like exist more on how do you say like consistently for a longer period of time, which means to subject someone to necro resistance for a longer period of time means one, you're losing on the active people who can actually be like directly proximate to the movement and keep doing this stuff. But second, people who are actively like worried about like this movement and want this movement to actually happen have irreversible harms towards themselves. We're unsure as to how these people can continue fighting for these causes. There have been 20 to 30 years where someone has been part of the feminism movement or the queer movement or even any movement that's proximate to them, right? Yet they're still fighting for it because they're able-bodied to do so. That's the difference between radicalism and the necro resistance. While with radicalism, whether or not you get change completely up to like the air, right? But then you're still an able-bodied person who can still pursue this level of political change that you can actively try to go for. The point in which you have necro resistance, you're actively causing harm towards yourself and your community. You're already a minority to begin with. You're just lessening yourself in terms of numbers. You're going into this fight handicapped. We don't think why you're able to then win, and we don't think why you should handicap yourself in the first place. But before I move on to my argument that we have in BOS, two aspects of social movement then. First, on the aspect of visibility that I've already clarified, and it takes out OG's context from then and there. Right? But second, on the aspect of political change. Here's how we'll say you will lack the level of political visibility that is necessary for social justice movements to win. Visibility and change in policies can only happen with consistent messaging. The problem then is movements are generally issued by minorities. You're already a smaller group. You want a policy that doesn't benefit the majority. The point in which you take the option of necro, you take matters into your own hands. This is problem because the prime minister themselves said how this is one of the first tools they take as a rebellion. Aren't sure how then you cause changes to happen, right? Why? This is also simply why third degree feminism just generally doesn't work, right? The radicalism aspect is something that fractures the movement. Not everyone proximately feels like they should be as intense into a movement, so they just back out, right? This is also a direct comparison to the deputy prime minister's aspect of like fracturing, right? But more importantly, the point in which you're actively against the system that is like, somewhat oppressing you, right? You're not giving them a chance to listen. Sure, international media comes in, right? But if the international media has never stopped China from like oppressing the Uyghurs or Israel to stop bombing Palestine, I don't think why then change happens from a local perspective. I think this is just a hoax of a story, right? The point in which we've showed to you one, oh my God, my page. Sorry. The point at which we quote to you, social movements then lose a level of public sympathy that exists on our side. You lose the negotiation leverage you can potentially hold with the people who can enact policy changes, right? Long-term social justice becomes harder to achieve because the general population becomes desensitized or even hostile towards activist causes. You lose the ability to garner political change, and we think opening opposition wins this tournament.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd now like to invite the member of government to open up the back half of the debate.
Yeah, hi. So before my speech, I think I also have a few shout outs. So first of all, to my partner Mia, thank you for being so supportive all over the whole tournament. It is very, very interesting and very wonderful to have discussions with you. So I'm really happy. I'm really happy. But second of all, thank you to the outcome that hold this very, very wonderful tournament. I have had chances in before to compete in similar tournaments, but I just eventually did not realize that. So I'm really, really glad that finally I have the chance to be competing in a tournament with very, very great things and very, very great emotions. Yeah. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. Prefer chat PY. Please do not verbally interrupt me and pronounce she or her. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opening government can claim some benefits in the status quo. Opening opposition can claim some disadvantages and some benefits in the status quo. But the problem is, none of them actually frames as to how the whole new world is going to be constructed and how social movement as a whole is going to be influenced from the beginning of the world, rather than describing some, things that happening right now, or just simply focusing on the status quo. Closing government is going to bring you a completely new different setup and explain to you as to why we're going to construct this whole kind of thing from the very beginning. Some things to know here. The first thing I want to know is that if we're constructing a new world, how will this movement be organized on government sides? The first is that we believe since there has been quite a long time. So basically, in the status quo, you have very long established organizations that are going to operate this kind of radical actions and stuff like this. But also, since it has been established for quite a long time, this means that you have the ability and capacity to actively seek connections with potential involvers, for example, governments and companies in the process to gain more funding or stuff like this. What this look like is that why other parties in the society will have the incentive to work with you. The first is that I think from the very beginning of the war, it's quite obvious that government does not have that much power to stigmatize or isolate this group of activists. Or you can see that media do not have that much leverage over this movement if things happen and then you do radical things. This means that the likely action they are going to take is they're going to quickly react to this kind of actions. For example, if this kind of radical action is caused by some problematic bills or policies, it is very likely they are going to react to just change this kind of problematic bills and policies and to have some kind of reforms. But what is more important is that in the future, when they are passing future policies, there are going to be more careful consideration as to whether this kind of new policies passed is going to cause new problems, because this kind of action is so radical. And when people first see this kind of thing, or at least for quite a long time, when people are being exposed to this kind of thing, even if they're not going to care about it at the end of the day, but when it just begins, I think people still have every incentive to care and to be fearful. This is also what drives the government to react quite responsibly to this kind of thing. But also notice the fact that when you have excessively using this kind of methods, this may at the end of the day turns out creating new institutions within government structure to deal with this kind of radical protest. For example, to have a negotiation, or for example, to explain as to how they are going to make changes to prevent potential future actions. But second of all, opposition argues how you are going to lose the chance to, for example, negotiate with companies, so on and so forth. We simply don't think that is the case, because of the fact that in the status quo or in their counterfactual, companies oftentimes do not want to negotiate with you if they have enough leverage over you. They have enough power to, stigmatize you on media, stuff like this. But what if they're doing this from the very beginning? This means that the best choice for them to do is, for example, to have to work with you to provide funding to this kind of movement, because they don't want their companies to be a next target or because when they see that you have some leverage over the government, it is still very beneficial to create bonds and connections with you. This means several things. This means that you have better protective safeguards for these protesters. This may look like more power to negotiate. This may look like international bodies or governments going to ensure that activists like physical safety. For example, you are going to have medical support during hunger strikes. You are going to have legal representation to prevent arbitrary arrest. Or even if you're being arrested, you are going to have more money to afford better lawyers. I don't know, to stuff like defend you in court, stuff like this. Then, in the status quo or in the counterfactual, why social movement is always lagging, or why people just do not have the incentive to join this kind of radical social movement at the very first instance. The first is, in terms of legal repression, kind of know that under counterfactual, when you are not a quite established or mature organization, this means that you just do not have the capacity in caring about the aftermath. For example, what are corresponding methods if people get caught? What are corresponding methods to deal with the family members if someone hurts themselves in protesting, or even worse, they die? You do not have the capacity to deal with all these kind of things. That's why people don't have the courage to opt in their first instance. But second of all, it's because of fear of stigmatization, being isolated and stigmatized by the rest of the society. Simply because, you just have this kind of radical action recently, and then people are just going to be quite scared, stuff like this. This means several things. That is, in the counterfactual, it's very hard for social movements to gather people and supporters to achieve their goal at the very first instance. But second of all, the lagging of social movements leads to several outcomes. The first is that government has the incentive to create more barriers to prevent potential further actions. For example, they are going to prioritize stability even at the expense of minority rights, because now you have missed the chances. You are not a mature organization. They have more leverage over you. But second is that they are going to portray that radical fights in the future will end up badly, like for example, probably without any kind of evidence, but just simply telling people that this is something bad, meaning this is just necessarily not true in a lot of the instances. We believe that this flips open opposition, because at the point in time you are trying to access this kind of last resort to solve really, really bad issues, you have already encountered many, many barriers from the government, from the media, a lot of stigmatization that you as an organization that is even not mature cannot guarantee the safety later, cannot guarantee the safety of your members and stuff like this. You simply are not attractive to a lot of the people. Then there's several impacts. The first is that in the counterfactual, you can only mobilize people to do radical things when things have become really worse. What about effects just simply don't work because you do not have enough leverage over the government to make them to make some kind of changes? You may need tangible deaths, hunger, and poverty to prove that things has already been quite worse, and at this point of time, only radical action, can be the thing and stuff like this. But when you have already, but when you're trying to adopt this kind of radical actions, the consequence is that you are going to face every obstacles we have already described to you. Then why? When you have instant reactions, when you have a mature organization, it's better on our self-pulse. This means that when problems happens, you have the power to gather people to do things. You're going to solve problems at the core. This means that from the beginning of the war, you have the power to change the power dynamics. You do not wait for a long period of time where you cannot gather people to do radical movements. The outcome of this is just have structural barriers,
Before 6?
being quite, it's already 6, sorry. You just have structural issues being quite lasting for hundreds or thousands, hundreds of years. At the point of time, it is just very hard to solve, even without radical issues. That is to say, not a single kind of, a social inequality is going to be last that long on closing government's work. Once you have this problem, you have every incentive to mobilize people to do radical actions and to make government and to persuade government to make instant changes. We believe that this impact is more important than any kind of things discussed in the opening half, because it's just more long-lasting. Proud to propose.
Okay.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to invite the member of opposition whenever you're ready.
Okay, just give me a second. Just need to set up my stuff. I guess this is where people give shout outs or say thank you, but it's pretty small thing. So I'll just say thanks for everyone who came here. I really like debating and women and gender minorities comps because I think it's an underrepresented group in debate. So it's very nice when we have comps with each other. It is also very nice because thank you to OC for waiving the fee. So this is my first time, I guess. It's not my first time in the Grand Final. And thank you to all of the other teams. It was very nice being able to compete against such high level teams, especially teams who I think are at the college level as a high school debater. So that's very nice. Very much appreciate getting to be part of high level debates at this level. I'll start on my next word. The saying I think that all teams miss within this round is the simple phrase of be reasonable. What do I mean by this? I mean that you should be reasonable enough that you should know that people don't want to set themselves on fire usually for all of the biological reasons that we'll give to you later. But it's also that on opening opposition, you ought to be reasonable enough to assume that the people on opening governments and closing government sides are facing a degree of like oppression that is incredibly harmful and are probably not irrational enough to set themselves on fire simply just for a bus ticket raise in price. I think that is the thing that we had to clear up in the debate, that we ought to be reasonable enough and assume the most charitable, or just not even the most charitable, but the most reasonable forms of framing within the debate. Things I want to clarify. I think firstly, what does excessive use look like? OG says that it's the main force. They conceded this very early by PM. So these are likely when individuals are pushed into the brink, but the important difference is that it has to be used, likely the first type of resistance that they resolve to. This is the important thing that are already exclusive of closing opposition. The comparative that we defend would be that of status quo, where the use of this would be proportional to stagnation of change. So if peaceful protests don't work and escalates to a point, then people would opt into this form of radical or violent protest at that point. Currently, these movements are likely in bad conditions anyways because they're minorities, they're going against large systems, and they are probably facing large forms of oppression. CG tries to argue that it's a world reset. I don't think this matters much. Why? It's too large of an assumption. There are other greater reasons why they wouldn't want to concede for these higher powers or protection of their social, or would like to have protection of their social power and status quo. So it's unlikely, and why opening half is correct in the way they debate to some degree about how the fact that it's about when we change our attitudes in this way. So how do we enter this debate? Well, simply be more charitable than opening opposition. The reason they will lose is because they make a very simple mistake. They assume that government only uses necro-resistance when you want a better bus schedule. That's simply unfair. We'll assume that the world of government is facing a lot of major oppressive harms, which is already one point of closing opposition. We'll then explain the comparative. Why is using more peaceful actions and letting it gradually escalate better? And even if it's just peaceful, it's just simply better. So we'll explain something very clearly. Why is there less buy-in on these movements? Given the way that it is excessive, what do these movements look like? This is the process, the specific process that you miss from opening opposition. It is when oppressive movements or oppressive coercive forces exist on these individuals, they feel these harms, and then automatically, in response, your first resort for these activists is to, for example, set yourself on fire. It's the first choice that you make. And this is the most important process clarification within the debate. What does this then mean for these movements? I think that number one, radical conservatives are likely to use this to make you seem insane. Because you first choose the most violent means, they're likely to use it as ammunition to explain why the movement ought not to be listened to. And this is where you don't see reasonable. This is where I find the CG claim that somehow this is more attractive absolutely untrue, because the average person, even after experiencing great harms, probably doesn't want to light themselves on fire because you have many things that you care about, like families to feed, people that you love, and neither GovHouse proves why this is a tipping point in debate. But that's secondly, it fractures the movement greatly because people are predisposed against violence. They don't like the image of putting yourself on fire. So people who are already within these movements are likely to opt out. But because of this, it separates and fractures the movement, which additionally creates divides and infighting. Why is this bad? For four reasons. Firstly, moderates are unlikely to buy in. One, for the reason that we explained, that you give reasons for them to opt into conservative movements or conservative ideologies who can weaponize us against them. Like imagine like your local conservative like politician looking at the regular killer activists on your street and saying, look at them, they're so violent. They will ask you to chain yourselves to trees and get yourself lit on fire like them. They're not thinking straight. They're insane. They have to be locked up. They didn't even ask for XYZ reasonable outcome. So what this does is it signals to people that they won't protect you or truly care for you and your body, which is why a moderate's unlikely to opt in. But that's secondly, because it's so fractured in the first place, there is a loss in power. So you feel as if the movement won't result in anything anyways. But secondly, it crowds up discussions. This particularly responds to opening government, who says that overtime window shifts. So because you jump to radicalism, you can now negotiate for stuff that seems smaller in comparison. Like, no, number one, it's untrue. The entire movement strategy is painted as monolithically violent, so people are less willing to do the more non-violent part. But two, even if it was true, the simple weighing is that we don't want our activists to die and risk their lives permanently for something that may not result in something positive anyways. But that thirdly, the other movements or ideas connected to you are ruined. So progressive ideas are seen as increasingly radical because of the fact that they associate themselves with people who set themselves on fire, which means that this is why the Palestinian movement, even when we were trying to do things that were very reasonable, like advocate for change in the most reasonable ways, like policy change or forum politicians, when a single person lights himself on fire, I'm not arguing the value of this, but when it does happen, these movements are then seen as increasingly radical, or it harms the other things that this person probably ascribed to. And four, this is the most important missing note from from opening opposition. You don't actually get people to care. Why? Because it is the small things that actively create communities that fight for each other, like donating, like soup kitchens, like marches. This creates hope and happiness, even within the line of fire. What this means is that on their side, people don't become so dedicated, which is horrible and why the process is so important and why you actively lose people, not just for the pragmatic reasons, but also because they just care a lot less. So why is buy-in relevant within this round? It's because movements are formed by people who don't have monetary capital or social currency. The importance is in numbers. This is why the OG mechanism for why small social movements is wrong. Within an oppressive system, I don't see why it's likely that there's going to be so negative. One, it becomes watered down, but secondly, it's more likely to fracture, like we explained before. When you spend more time, number one, infighting, and secondly, with people leaving, then you get less pragmatic benefits. This is when you waste more efforts and you have the opportunity cost that happens on their end. This is the missing impact on opening opposition. Why? Because this is the only way that we can actually understand the mechanisms that they provide. Diallo says that visibility matters and uses this as a one-liner, but what we ought to say is that this is actually the most important thing in the round because it is what creates care. It is what creates people who actually move the movement in the first place. The amount of people and actually proving it at CO is why we win. What is the important comparative that we give on our side that does not exist at opening opposition and only comes out here? Firstly, what does this look like? One, you would first opt into more peaceful and find other efforts to legitimize yourself, like doing things like rallying, like marching, like having things that would be more smaller, like donating, and trying to do more political things that wouldn't automatically result in just self-immolation. But that secondly, you would eventually end up buying into self-immolation if it goes to those worst instances, but it is a last resort. Why is this better? Because one, you either get what you want because you're viewed as reasonable. Two, you either get what you want because you've reached a point that people won't view reasonable. So this particularly when moderates are actually more likely to listen to you because of the fact that they've seen the progress of your movement. But three, you build the foundations for people to actively care about each other, to meet each other, to value each other, not just as activists, but as people. Even if we're forced into a more peaceful comparative, I ought to believe that's fine. One, because we don't risk the lives of these people. Lives taken are just inherently bad, but the way we prove it is it's unlikely manifest in the way that they want, a life lost with no return. But secondly, it's just incredibly less divisive. And lastly, there's just much more cause for unity on our side.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd now like to invite the government whip to finish up the prop bench.
Great. Again, just this is already recorded, so it's fine. Okay. You guys in the chat. Okay, preference. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Yeah. I'll just first deal with the biggest chunk of analysis coming from COing regarding how you're going to be largely demonized, so you don't have a lot of buy-ins. Savages in the early 20th century were called hysterical and just destructive for using tactics like hunger strikes and stuff like that. But nowadays people just celebrate these heroes of fighting gender equality, right? So I don't think that they're comparative when they're saying this, because the people who are in power, they will always demonize radical movements to discredit their legitimacy, even if they're trying to talk about how conservatives will not join this and stuff like that. But when they see this, they will ask themselves this question: is it crazier to just not do anything about genocide, or is it crazier to just Yeah, sorry, I lost trace of thought, but you get what I'm saying. Basically, I don't think that they're being comparative about like why such demonization and this kind of buying will just not happen, right? But then I think the crucial framing that CG gave you here is that this is a disaster first world motion, meaning that we'll probably have to go back in time to say that it's not likely to be like long-lasting issues because from the starting of the time, because part of the reason why like we have very deep-rooted problems in the society is because over and over the accumulation of piles of problems just don't get addressed. And my partner already gave you several mechanisms as to why this is true, right? And we're able to change that from the start of time. The status quo is where people cannot really join like radical movements because of social stigma and lacking like significant tools to do it. And that's how exactly CG is able to solve all these problems, right? And also, just one clarification here is that, of course, people are going to do it selectively and like gradually escalate, right? But eventually, we believe it is more likely the protester will win for the simple reason that there's simply too many protests every day happening. And in order to maintain functioning society, the government needs to take faster actions compared to the status quo, making meaningful changes, reform government institutions, and maybe just enact laws that have been meaninglessly debated in parliament for years. The reason why this is important is because help and foreign aids are extremely time sensitive. Justice delayed is justice denied, right? The reason why women are still sexualized is because we were taught to voice out in a very civilized way in a chat through government website that would never load however many times you refresh, through police department where your scars are over and over put salt on when you're filling in long forms of questioning, describing every detail of what scenario when you were harassed, right? In our world, we're happy to support a lobby gang where you just go to a group of people who would protest like every once in a while until you're seen and addressed, right? Now responding to the desensitization argument coming from OO. Sure, you're probably going to see protests every once in a while, but compared to their side, where they don't often have these direct visual link between death and social oppression, you're even less likely to be reminded of these. It's parallel because their side people are also like desensitized about like social media posts and stories. They cannot say they are more sustainable because by sustainable they mean they lose opportunity window and putting off of reforms. When a protester chains themselves to like let's say a deportation center, they embody the plight of refugees in a way that statistics just cannot, right? This personalizes the issue, making it harder for observers to just dismiss as, oh, just another protest. Also, CG uniquely told you how we ensure changes while like safeguarding these like human lives, right? Because there will probably be more laws to distinguish like between oppressive systems and marginalized groups' desperate acts of resilience, right? Actions like training oneself to infrastructure would be legally permitted if they target oppressive institutions like fossil fuel companies without harming innocent people, right? So like probably there's also going to be like a lot of these like international bodies assessing the physical safety, like how you ensure them like medical support whatsoever, right? Because on their side, governments like the US are usually largely affected and controlled by lobbyists. So even if they probably care about like certain social causes, um, like meaning that they don't really have the autonomy to go against like large like oil companies directly, but they probably can provide help to protesters because it is more justifiable to provide help because you can't criticize the government for saving lives. But the lobbyists would be unhappy if the government refused their donation. This means that you're likely to get help from radical protesters, help to reform your government structure, at least get corporations to be more green, like with the help of extreme political consumerism. This is especially true for smaller governments who has less leverage against big MNCs. But in our world, when people are more actively engaging in radical movements, changes are more likely to happen because it breaks the cycle of lobbyists lobbying and governments passively accepting. But the problem with the status quo is big actors prioritize like profit or like power over human life, right? This means when opposition say, people will be harmed and they will be dead, blah, blah, blah. We have a direct way up between people who might get bodily harms and those exploited like women in households and like prostitutes under patriarchal society on their side, exploited like child labor who get beaten to death. On their side, they still have thousands of people die every day in dark alleys when these social issues don't just get addressed, right? Why these issues don't get addressed in the status quo then? Because you're going to frame gender issues as safety issue, i.e., if you're beaten up as a woman, you should go to the police, right? You see the social societies like trying their best to generalize social issues and to give out inefficient blanket policy. There's no exclusive laws protecting subset of people under each group where intersectional minorities get harmed by one type of harm and another, right? We are the only side that can create meaningful changes when we have more people joining radical protests because now they have significant tool to protect them because of like these newly established institutions, but second of all, more protection for these people, as I mentioned earlier. Presumably both sides have radical movements, but on their side, government just use this to further demonize minorities and capture them into jail. But on our side of the house, when you have more laws to like protect these things and justify these things, it's more likely to happen, right? So on our side, what you get is basically people are more likely to unite and join these kind of radical protests because we prioritize collective liberation, not individual power. And what's also going to happen is probably that you're going to like have like delegation of power from the top echelon of the ruling class because you fear people will disrupt you every day and like just shake your ruling power and whatsoever. So counting from the starting of the time, you're less likely to have all these kind of oppression from the get-go because you want to make yourself efficient as a government so you don't get all these protests every day, making the society a mess. So for all these reasons, CG.
Thank you very much for that speech. And finally, I'd like to invite the opposition whip to begin their case.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Great. POIs through chat, please. Again, POIs through chat. Give me a couple of seconds, then I'll start my speech. Okay. Speech starts in 3, 2, 1, go. The first thing that I want to do is just deal with the stuff that is exclusively OG and that's exclusively CG, and then I'll deal with just the entire chunk of like, is this going to be effective? The exclusive thing that we get from OG is the positive stuff to prove that this is important because it gets more attention. First response. There are other ways of getting attention for things like sometimes conflict escalates, or sometimes movements just gain traction, not just because a spectacle was created, but because several people are backing it. Politicians, for example, spotlight these movements through things like grassroots negotiations during election time. But let's say, yeah, some people, like someone self-immolating does go around Twitter for a while. It does create and spark discussions. We say that the problem is, one, that isn't often sustainable because yes, it is normalized, but also because the default takes away from the time to lay down a foundation of people who will continue to care and who will continue to talk about it. But secondly, the attention, it's like the idea of attention itself is a value neutral thing. We comparatively posit that this attention is likely to be bad. It's likely to manifest in painting the movement as inherently violent, which they're likely to lose, especially considering that the people who are going to do this are going to be like those with like media hegemonies, etc. But it's also that they do not have people like moderates and liberals who are empathetic because they chose to go directly to the most divisive way of like going about social resistance. The second thing is just what is like uniquely COs. I guess it's the framing of like a world reset. I think Regina dealt with this beautifully. She talked about how this isn't too important because obviously world leaders or governments are not just going to suddenly be more effective now in this world reset. There are far greater reasons for why they do not want to concede things like the protection of their social power, which is reliant on ensuring that they continue to go against and demonize these like social movements, etc. But also when they talk about like less social stigma because now it is normalized. I'm gonna talk about that in this next chunk of my speech. Right. So the broadest thing is just to talk about will the approach that they have work? There are two things under this. Firstly is on buy-in. The second is on fracturing. Firstly, on why they lose buy-in. Note that this is the missing impact from O because they're right in proving the first layer that people will see them as more radical and violent. But the problem is that OG already argues that that's what they want anyway because of Overton window. Comparatively, we prove the reasons for why this leads to the movement losing buy-in from Regina. The first is just because this means that this becomes a standard participation within movements. And like, I don't know about you, but a lot of people do not like being put in a position where they have to starve or where they have to self-immolate or where they have to tie themselves into buildings just to be seen as a dedicated or legitimate form of participating in a movement, precisely because government frames all of the other alternatives, things like peaceful protests, as something that is just useless, that has taken time away from real justice. The second is that often they have to do things like alienate moderates or even people like liberals who are already left-leaning because they chose to go to the most divisive way of going about justice. Thirdly, note that this overturned window shift argument they have just doesn't stand because often it will be crowded out. Know that it is very easy to monolithically box these movements as inherently violent, so it doesn't work if they just jump to it instead of doing things like baking in radicalism, getting people to go through the process in the first place. This means that government is likely to lose with this as their main line of defense because buy-in is where these groups gain power. I do not care. It's like their power is not about whether they're more radical or more peaceful. It is about if they have more people to opt in, and that just so happens to only happen when they choose more peaceful or when they do more incrementalist ways of social justice. Note that on their side, the fact that they do not have this means that these movements are often left to continually be socially ostracized. They don't have a lot of resources to begin with, so this is fatal for them. The second issue then is just the question of fracturing. Coming from government, they say that the cause of fracturing is that movements are made up of people of different levels of commitment. First, low-hanging fruit. If they want every single person in their movement to participate in this, sure, they're quote-unquote more dedicated, but yeah, they're also more hungry and dead, so I'm not really sure what their way forward is. But second, the less annoying response is just that isn't what causes fracturing. Fracturing happens on their side because of things like the morality of self-immolation and starvation is inherently divisive, because we're talking about whether or not you're willing to lay your life down for things like a principle. So it's extreme and will likely garner that type of reaction as well, and that will cause more people to discuss what approach should the left take, what approach should social movements take, and that causes an opportunity cost because instead of doing things like mobilizing with each other, they have to deal with all of the sensationalization of media, and they're also continually arguing with each other. Second, the problem is that as a default main line of protest, they don't allow for people to become dedicated, and that's their problem, right? That's the value of the process and making this a last resort, which OO didn't prove, right? It's the fact that going through this process means getting people to do more smaller things like donations, to go to peaceful marches, etc., which makes them more willing to increasingly become radicalized because they get exposed to it through incrementalist ways. That makes them more dedicated to it. So the problem that government has on these people aren't dedicated is something that they impose on themselves. We tell you without this process, often people will then default to their biological aversion to violence, to opting out of this because they can't really eat principles, can they? Or they just have no reason to not think that the person trying to tie themselves to a building is a nuisance. In fact, that's the third reason as to why they're likely to fail. Because they don't allow for this process to happen, that means the excessive and default use of this removes its effectivity. These reasons are different from OO because it's not just a loss in shock value, but even if people don't stop being shocked by someone setting themselves on fire, which fair enough, keeping it as a last resort is better and more likely to be effective. You're able to build a movement from a ground up, and that's where you're going to be able to garner more people who are willing to defend you on Twitter, who are willing to talk about your death continually and not just bypass it, right? So the weighing is simple, right? Insofar as we're able to prove that they're likely to fail, then this is bad, because what they do is that there are a lot of people committing irreversible harms, being starved and dying. Two, if it doesn't work like how it did with Tibet, then that's a life taken. That's someone dying of hunger. That's someone who could have continued to protest, and more importantly, that's a life lost. We say that risk is not justified, especially if they aren't sure that this is the only way that they can succeed, and if they could have gone through other alternative processes first in order to achieve justice. Our worst case is that maybe peaceful protests take a while, but we prove that that isn't so bad precisely because peaceful protest ensures that it's more sustainable, because we're able to get a lot of buy-in, not just from the most dedicated people, but even from moderates and liberals, who will then have more incentive to increasingly believe in your cause and believe that it is something that is worth dying for. But secondly, we are able to prove that all their benefits are just gone at the point at which they excessively use this and make this a default approach. For all these reasons, it's a CO win.
Thank you very much for that speech, and thank you to all the speakers. So now, myself and the judges will head into room 1 to deliberate. Best of luck with the result, guys. Thank you.
Thanks for the round.